Bishop's Economic Pastoral. Topic tonight is the problem of poverty and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Each of these lectures is rather an autonomous unit, and so we're always welcoming newcomers. We have notes from last week. If anyone is looking for those, you will find those in the back. And also some copies of the pastoral letter, if you're interested in those, are in the back row as well. And I think we still have some more copies of that update article. Some of you had it last week. I don't know if I have one right at hand here. I guess not. But anyway, that might be a good thing to look at as a summary of the bishop's pastoral. Well, tonight I want to begin again by trying to get a feel for this question of poverty in our country. A lot of us in the room probably don't know that exactly, what poverty is like. I suppose some have lived in that. As Karl Rahner likes to say, that in the modern world, even members of religious orders who take a vow of poverty are really not poor in the sense that so many people in the world really are. So that it's really hard to get a feel for what that means. One of the ways that I've been in touch with that world is through correspondence over many years. There's a poor woman who writes me regularly and tells me about her situation, and I begin to get somewhat of a feel of what she goes through. And the word that keeps coming to me as I read her letters is powerlessness. The woman can't grab hold. Things are very difficult for her. She can't make things happen. So she's there trying to raise these two youngsters. She's, when the end of the month, she gets food stamps, but by the end of the month, she's always running out, and there's a great fear that the stamps aren't going to last her throughout the month. Her children are a big part of the problem for her because she'd like to give them the kind of luxuries that other people have, and she can't do it. But it gets even worse. The other kids make fun of her kids at times, makes her feel bad because she can't dress them as well as she would like, can't give them the gifts and toys at Christmas time that other kids get. She has been trying to get a big brother for her youngsters for quite a while and hasn't been able to achieve that. And it's a good lesson in this powerlessness business. I mean, no matter, it seems like wherever she turns and who she asks, there's always some block. She makes phone calls and they're not answered. She can't get any action on things. And so all this time she's been trying to get a big brother for her youngsters so that they would have a male influence in their life, and she simply hasn't been able to accomplish that. Medical bills are such a great problem for her. She had particular medical problems, and she owes large amounts of money on that. She sees no foreseeable way that she could ever pay these debts off. And she's always worried about having to take the youngsters to the doctor, not having the kind of insurance she would need to attend to them. Who will care for them if she gets sick? How will she manage all of that? She feels in many ways that she can't get legal action on her behalf. For a long period of time, she's trying to get the husband of her, father of her children, to help support those kids. And she can't do it, and so she tries to get legal help, and she always feels frustrated that the legal help doesn't come through the way she would like it to. She always thinks that the father of the children has more powerful lawyers and can keep delaying things and has all these tactics, and she has no place to turn. She can't ever seem to find anybody who really would help her out and try to overcome these kinds of problems. And she's upset with the kind of housing that she lives in. It's some sort of subsidized housing, but it seems not to be taken care of. The people don't care about the property and so on. She doesn't seem to be able to do anything about that as well. So I get a stream of letters from her just over and over, and it's always has that same theme that she's on the margins, that she's of no account, that she can't get what she wants, she feels powerless. And that's one of the things that the bishops in their pastoral letter really try to stress, that the poor do not participate. They're not involved in what is going on. So we have to try, I think, to get a feel for this. Those of us who eat 3 meals a day and who have a place to sleep and are able to have some of the luxuries of life and so on, it is so easy to forget about those people. You remember when Michael Harrington wrote the book back in the 60s, The Invisible Poor, and tried to raise that upwards and bring in front of our eyes the plight of people like this. But no matter how we might go about this, we don't really get a hold of it. You might have seen the ABC series on homelessness. And I quote in here some of the statistics they came up with. What it amounts to is there's a lot of homeless people around. And one of the things they did was they followed Andy Young around. He went around and down in Atlanta with the homeless people and a reporter and slept in the shelters that night and so on. And one of the interesting comments was, try as they might to get into what it was like, and it was cold and so on, and the people were uncaring, and they said when you passed by people, they didn't want to see you. The well-to-do people, the middle-class people, always averted their glance. Even though that was the mayor of their city there. He felt like a sort of non-person. But then the telling comment at the end of all of this sort of experiment, they could go back home, to their homes. And here are these other people, they estimate 250,000 or a couple million. No one really knows how many of those people are out there. No place to go. They don't have a time when they call the experiment off and try to find a place. And I think that piece on homelessness told us some other things, too, about the structural kind of problems. They were trying to point out what has caused this, and one of the causes is a very supposedly humane program, this deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. And so the idea was that these people are in these institutions, and that's terrible, and we should get them out of there and get them back into the mainstream of society. So the idea in the 60s, 70s, we began this and to empty out these institutions. There were supposed to be shelters built for them and houses, places for them to go. Federal funds got cut, so we didn't have that for them. And so right now we have large numbers of mentally ill people really unable to fend for themselves, to take care of themselves on the street. Homeless people, resulting from what looked like sort of an enlightened, humane policy. Let's get them out of these institutions here. And then we think of urban renewal. We sort of relish that, and we think, well, that's marvelous. We're going to renew the cities and so on. And often that means building new skyscrapers downtown and putting office buildings up and so on. And as they showed what that did in the city of Chicago, where they had that kind of renewal and everyone's sort of proud of the city about it and so on, that means that a whole lot of old hotels got torn down and places where the poor used to live quite cheaply, and now these people are out on the street as well. In other words, city policies as well as state policies end up causing this kind of homelessness. And then the federal government is cut back large amounts of money. I think cut it in about a third during the Reagan administration, the money put forth for public housing. So you start to put all that together, and here in this affluent country, we got these, what I think is probably millions of people roaming the streets with no place to go. So again, that helps to put the human face on what poverty is about. To have no lodging, no place to have roots. They had, what was the lady's name they interviewed? Daisy Page, I think was her name. And she was there in the shelter with her small kids. And they were talking about the kids and what it means to not really have a home. And to just be in this shelter, no rootedness, no place to put the few possessions they really had or to take care of and make sure they wouldn't be stolen and so on. Again, the face of poverty in our own country. Well, now when people start to talk about this, you get a lot of debates going on. As you know, the bishops take the government statistics and say there's about 33 million poor people. Now there's a whole school of thought that says, well, that's misplaced. That's way out of whack. You don't have that many poor people in the country because they don't count in, and this is true, they don't count in food stamps and Medicaid and things like that would raise many of these people up above the poverty level. So you got a group of people who say it's overblown and the problem isn't nearly as big as the bishops like to say. Michael Novak would be a good example of that. And using the same sort of polarities as I used before, Michael Harrington, the chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America, makes the opposite claim. He says there's more. He thinks there's like 50 million poor people around. He's the one who wrote that book on the invisible poor back in the 60s. And he says today, because we don't count the undocumented aliens, there's a lot of people who don't want to be counted in the census for one reason or another, so that there's really more people running around, maybe as many as 50 million poor people in our country. So you get a dispute on that. Again, what the bishops have done is sort of adopt some sort of middle way in all of this. Now, just going through the next section in the notes, we're talking about the characteristics of poverty. And I suppose what you get out of all of that, if you read through all of the statistics, is there is this notion that the people on welfare and so on are these able-bodied males who refuse to work and are milking the system and drive around in nice cars and so on. And the bishops try to point out to us that that really isn't true, that most of the poor people are either not able to work, they're young or too old, or they're disabled, or there are people who are working and still fall below the poverty line. And then the sort of telling statistic, and one of the reasons that all of this has happened back a number of years ago, if you were making the minimum wage, you would be above the poverty line. But for 6 years now, the minimum wage has not been raised, so if you're making the minimum wage today, trying to support a family of 3, you are far below the poverty line. So they give us a picture of poverty, the characteristics of it. They're disproportionately female, disproportionately minority. What is it? 1 out of every 2 black children under 6 in the United States is poor. Half the black children under 6 are living under the poverty line. Now that doesn't mean they're living like people in Calcutta that Mother Teresa takes care of. I think that's important to realize. But we do indeed have a disproportionate number of the poor in this way. Now, number C, economic inequality, and here we get another one of the disputes going on. The bishops look at, say, we got disproportion in the amount of wealth that people have, large disproportions in the United States. The richest 2% of the family sold 28% of the wealth. And we got less severe disparity in the income. But when they look at all of this, they end up saying that this is unjust. When you look at the gap between rich and poor in the United States, it's unjust. Now, we think of ourselves as having this large middle-class population, and we do. But I think they say someplace that among the industrialized Western nations, the gap in the United States is larger than we find in those other countries between the top percentage and those at the lower level of the socioeconomic ladder. So their conclusion is the disparities in both income and wealth are simply not acceptable. This is an immoral situation. Now, the people who argue on the other side say, well, that's not important. The gap doesn't count. What counts is whether the system brings more and more people up above the poverty line or not. And so they would pose this kind of question. They'd say, suppose the gap between the richest top 5%, say, and the lowest 25% in our country was even greater than it is now, but the lower 20% were all living up above the poverty line. What would you say about that? Now, the dispute, in other words, that's sort of a hypothetical statement on their part that wants to get the other side to think, is it the gap that bugs you, or is it the fact that we got so many people, there's 33 million living in poverty? Which is it that you're really concerned about? gets more complicated by those economists who then say, but no, it's the very gap that is causing this poverty. Michael Harrington would represent that school of economic thought, that it is the great disparity that's keeping people down, that the poor are taxed too heavily and the well-to-do not taxed enough. And that what he thinks psychologically happens is that the middle-class people in the United States, when they feel the pinch and they're not happy, they end up taking it out on the poor and not the rich. Another thing I noted, that this is a very interesting psychological reaction. I think that is generally true. I mean, you don't often hear middle-class people complaining about the great amounts of money that wealthy people have. It seems, I mean, sometimes you do, but I don't think that's the dominant sentiment. It's like, well, it's neat, or those movie stars, they got a lot of money and fine and athletic figures and so on. But the real anger seems to come out against the poor, who are on welfare and getting the doles from the government and so on. Harrington wants to say that, well, that isn't really where the anger ought to be. The anger ought to be directed at those who have so much wealth and who are able to get so many benefits still from the government. When you're talking about these handouts or welfare, it's a matter not just of things being given to the poor. They want to say, well, what about all the breaks corporations get? You know, you've read these things where some of the largest corporations for years paid no taxes. And I'm always surprised that doesn't make more news and that, people don't get really angry about that kind of situation. But people seem to be more upset with able-bodied males driving Cadillacs who are on welfare. That's the stereotype of what catches the popular middle-class imagination. Now, another sort of disputed point comes up under the causes of poverty. When the bishops look at it, they see unemployment, and there's a lot of agreement on that. And then they see the problem of discrimination. They think that's why women and minorities are below the poverty line because they don't get equal pay. The feminization of poverty, as they talk about, unjust distribution, and so on. So when they look at the problem, they say, there, discrimination, unemployment, that's what we've got to work at. Now on the other side of all of this, the sort of neoconservatives, who are the, capture, as Michael Crosby, I think, said very well, the big people who seem to attack are the bishop's pastoral are the columnists. People like George Will and James Kilpatrick and William Buckley, who themselves are not economists either. They're always challenging the bishops because they're not economists, which they haven't really claimed to be. But these represent this kind of what we generally call neoconservative opinion today. And what these people keep saying is, no, that's not the problem. What is causing poverty in the United States is male irresponsibility. That is, illegitimate births. The fact that we have so many children being born out of wedlock, and that's what's producing the poverty. It's in the single-parent households headed by women and having children at a very young age, and this is what is the real cause of the growth in poverty. As you know, we've had like 7 million more people fall below poverty during the Reagan administration. One of the great sad things about all this is that it's growing, that we're not making progress on poverty. We're getting worse as each year goes on. So the neoconservatives, I say, the problem is the breakdown of family life. And the real solution here, therefore, is for the churches. What the bishops ought to be doing is not attacking the economic system or making these policy suggestions. They ought to be preaching to people to have sexual abstinence and to have males exercise responsibility in the culture and care for the children they bring into the world, and try to find ways to help teenagers from getting pregnant and bringing these youngsters they can't support into the world. Now, number 3 in this thing, there's a very recent study just in the papers within the last few weeks of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, really sort of debunks the neoconservative viewpoint, and they have statistics which claim, as you notice here, that the households headed by married couples account for 45% of the poverty increase, while single-parent, female-headed families accounted for 31%. In other words, what they're saying is the primary problem is not illegitimacy. No, the primary problem has to do with other factors, most closely aligned with unemployment. We had far less poverty going during the Second World War, when we had 1% unemployment and all kind of people working. That seems to be the real thing it's tied to. So anyway, a dispute again, and you keep getting in the neoconservative literature this idea that the bishops are on the wrong track. They should be talking about moral values and sexual abstinence and all of building up family life, instead of going off in these policy directions about how to reform the welfare system and so on. Now, it's interesting to note that as the three drafts of all the way up to the final fourth draft, which is only a small change in the bishop's pastoral, they did make much more effort to get the family question in there. There's a lobby in Washington. The family life people are very strong. And whenever a bishop's pastoral letter is written, they are in there pushing to get a family dimension, as they say. I got calls a lot from those people when we were doing the campus ministry pastoral, and right up to the very end when they were ready to vote on it in Washington, we were still getting amendments from the family life people to get more of that dimension in there. So they are a rather strong lobby within the Catholic community. And what happened is that the neoconservatives, like Michael Novak, and the family life people really put a lot of pressure on the bishops, and as time went on, the document did get more oriented to the importance of healthy family life if we're going to solve a lot of our economic problems. Well, when you get down to all of that, I'm back to the last part of that whole thing there, and that is the powerlessness. Whether there's 33 million or 20 million, we got a heck of a problem. In an affluent country where a lot of us are trying to diet and not eat too much, it seems sort of silly to have a system where you got all these people living below the poverty line, and women worried about feeding their youngsters at the end of the month, and not being able to take care of medical bills, and being worried to take their youngsters to the doctor, and not being able to find big brothers for them, and all of that kind of thing. One at least has to see that there's a difficult problem here, and one that has to be addressed. Let's take a little break here and do our one-to-one discussion. I'd invite you to respond any way that you care to. Again, and as I did last time, I invite some of you might want to respond very personally about something of what it means to be poor, if you know poor people. If not, to sort of discuss in a more objective manner the material in that first Roman numeral there. Let's take a couple minutes to do that. So glad to hear any kind of responses. Yeah.
About that gap between the rich and the poor in the United States, what about a country like Caracas? Where the poverty is absolute destitution, the people rich and whatsoever. That gap, to my mind, seems a lot wider than the American gap.
Well, the question is asked about Caracas, or I suppose you could say any number of Latin countries and so on. The comment that I made was that the United States, in comparison to the Western democracies, that the gap is greater than we find in those countries. And I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, but I have read that kind of thing. Now, I think we'd be looking at France and West Germany, Holland, and so on. And of course, no, if you look at the Latin countries, the gap is obviously much greater than we would have here in the United States. I guess there's sort of a general point about that, the way you view our economy. Some people, when they look at it, say, look, we've done so well. It's like Novak saying we produced 26 million new jobs in the last 20 years or so. While Western Europe's lost all those jobs. And we've brought people up to a standard of living that was unheard of. That years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, everybody lived in poverty practically. And here we've made all this progress. And the bishops, I keep saying, yeah, we've made progress, but we got further to go. And then when they start saying, well, where are we in the relationship to the rest of the world? Well, we're not doing as well as we might. Where's the one stat? We're about 15th in infant mortality rate. Oh, I wanted to talk about that later on tonight if we get time. But that's amazing. That's a very strange statistic, since that's often connected with the general health of the population and care for pregnant women and so on. But anyway, so I think that's when you get a mixed thing. Some people look at the system and say, man, we're doing well. Look at all these nice, well-fed people running around the United States. Other people are saying, no, but yeah, we've done well, but we could do better. And it seems to always be the theme that when John Kennedy was running for office, was always that theme. We can do better. You know, we got greater resources than that here. It's almost like they're resurrecting that kind of theme. It's like, here's a time for new progress, a new revolution in economic rights, as we have done so well with civil rights. Now let's do the same with economic rights.
Is the minimum wage higher in like the other countries? You know, I was just thinking it's really very difficult if you work 40 hours at minimum wage to have any kind of housing or anything if you're one person.
The question is asked about our minimum wage compared to other places. Again, I don't have my economist here tonight. Couldn't make it. I don't know the answer to that. But what is, the point that many of the authors make is, it's remained at $3.35 since 1981, and while inflation has gone up, the price of goods has gone up. Yeah, it's terribly difficult. Actually, that's one of the sad things. We got so many working poor. People work full time, and they're still below the poverty level, can't support a family on that.
And the other thing is, a lot of the women, they fall in all the time. It's, like where I work, we have a lot of minimum wage people, and as soon as they earn too much money, they lose all their benefits, and they don't really gain enough to make up for what they've lost. And it's just such, a difficult situation.
Yeah. People can't hear that. The point was, Janice was saying that the people making minimum wage, and thinking a lot of the women who work at her place in the nursing home, making minimum wage, just can't quite stay above things. And then if they do make too much money, working, I suppose, overtime or more hours and so on, they might end up losing some of their benefits and so on. And of course, that's when we start asking policy decisions how we're going to adjust things. That's certainly part of what people are looking for, so that there wouldn't be penalties for working like that.
What is the poverty line in this establishment so far as dollars and cents per year?
The poverty line in the United States is approximately $10,000 for an urban family of 4. It was begun back in 1955 and it was done by computing the cost of food and then thinking that was 1/3 of the expenditures of a family. So they computed the lowest type of amount of food you'd have to buy to keep this urban family of 4 going, multiplied that by 3 to get the number that gave you the poverty line. And what has happened, of course, is that the poverty line, as inflation goes up, as goods cost more, the poverty line is kept being adjusted by government statistics. So it's currently something like, it's just under $10,000 for an urban family of 4. So any family making less than that is considered to be under the poverty line. So the 33 million. So here's some guy making $9,000 a year and raising 3 kids, and let's say raising 2 kids and having his wife there. Those 4 people are counted among the 33 million. Now again, when you say the stats are always so confusing and so it can be used in so many different ways, the neoconservatives will say, well, a lot of those people who are sort of frugal and careful about things, they're living quite well, or they're making it all right. And that you can't hardly count this guy as making $9,500 a year in the same category as someone who's not making anything. In other words, this 33 million needs to get parsed out a bit and to see that there's different kinds of people living in that poverty. But that's how they figure it. So the bishops take government statistics, but Novak is right, that doesn't include food stamps. It doesn't include other kind of benefits like that. I think you end up getting lost in the statistics myself. I think that we end up saying there's a lot of poor people around and this isn't right. I mean, that's where I'm at, I'd say. We got to know the facts and try to get at the stats, and they're revealing in a way, but you can just argue back and forth all day about them, and people seem to interpret them in various ways, and I think we got a problem. Got too many poor people running around.
Other cities too. The bottom line there. Novak and others put more emphasis on productive justice and on distributive justice. I thought the idea of a gap and the large 5% making more money was that it could be redistributed over more people for equality. Is that true or not?
Well, gets us down to what a lot of the debate is about. Has been the Reaganomics, as we have said. It was called trickle-down theory, and it was called supply-side theory. It's based a lot on the thinking of people, I suppose, like Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago and that whole economic school. And the idea of those people is that, well, if the upper groups get tax breaks, for example, they will have more money to invest, and then when they invest more money in like new businesses and so on, that's how we will create new jobs. So that if we gave tax breaks to corporations, then they would begin to modernize their factories, and we get greater productivity and so on. That was the trickle-down theory, or the supply-side theory, that's how it was going to work. And, of course, what the critics say on the other side is, well, that hasn't worked. That when corporations get tax breaks, they just buy other corporations. Well, they don't do anything constructive. The steel industry hasn't modernized, for example. They haven't done the job of keeping up with the computer. They haven't used whatever capital they had to do that. And this whole trickle-down theory simply hasn't worked. We got 7 million more poor people now during the Reagan years. So that's how it is argued. You get the general schools of economic thought. You get the theories of how all of this is supposed to work. But the question is, I see a consensus point that we got to have employment. The more, as the Congressional Committee says, that poverty seems most closely tied to unemployment. So that if we can get down to 3% unemployment, we're going to raise a lot of people up above the poverty level. But then how do we generate the unemployment? I mean, the greater the jobs. And that becomes, as I said last time, the Fortune 500 companies have not generated new jobs for a decade. Government hasn't generated new jobs for a decade. All these 26 million new jobs have come from small businesses. And today, you see in the paper recently, many of which are headed by women these days, a growing number headed by women, which, may augur well for this feminization of poverty problems. So, we really need I'm not an economist, I'm a layman in this thing, but as I keep reading this economic theory, you see, there's schools of thought. It's like my world of theology. You begin to see it's very similar to that world. You look at the reality, and one person sees it this way, and they got a powerful theory, and people gravitate around it. So Milton Friedman says, that we got to go at it a different way, get government out of things, and the private sector and so on will work. All this goes back to Adam Smith, 1776, The Wealth of Nations. Same year as our Declaration of Independence. And Adam Smith started this theory of saying, well, self-interest will generate wealth. That what you got to do is to free up, get this free market, get competition going, parse out the labor to various people, and this sort of self-interest on the part of people will generate wealth. And that's where Novak gets down to the productive wealth. He says we can't lose sight of what Adam Smith taught us, that he was, the wisest of teachers, and that's how you do it. You got to free people up, give them the opportunity, get government out of the picture, get free enterprise going, and these creative entrepreneur types will then figure out new ways to do things and generate jobs, and we create wealth. And he says the bishops won't consider that. They keep thinking of distributive justice. Distributive justice means how you distribute the wealth that's there. It's like they say that, well, the economic pie is only so big. This is the zero-sum society, as one of the economists wrote it. And there's only so big so that if the wealthy get more, the poor get less. And the other people say, that isn't right. It isn't a zero-sum society. We've got a growing, expanding economy, and that the way you get people to move into the mainstream is to get to have the productive justice, creativity, get people going, getting the engine running, and that will produce more jobs and raise people up. And that's been the Reagan philosophy for the last 6 years, which, as I say, has produced 7 million more poor people throughout this town. In one sense, maybe it's good to have a layman talk about those things, because maybe I can say it in a way that people haven't read Econ 101 lately to better understand it. But I mean, I'm a layman, and that's, it's good to remember that. That's my reading of it. With the free enterprise people, and then you got, on the other hand, you have the people that say, well, it's a bunch of baloney. We don't have a free enterprise system. You got government subsidies for everything, for tobacco growing. We got the Surgeon General getting up and saying, we shouldn't be smoking, and the government subsidizing tobacco growing. And that the corporations get all kind of breaks, didn't pay any tax. I wish I could think of it as General Dynamics. For years they know they got this vast profit, and they pay no taxes. I don't know if it was about 6 companies like that. Again, the details escape me, but the general idea is clear. You got these people making all kind of money and paying no taxes. So they say, well, that's a bunch of baloney. You don't have a free enterprise system. The large corporations don't function that way. They raise inflation. The other school of thought says they don't help us at all. They're willing to keep giving more wages to the workers because all they do is jack up the price of cars then. And they're not fair about the amount of money that they pay out to the smaller distributors that feed in their materials and their parts to their car. They're not really tight with that, haven't been tight with that. They just raise the price of the cars so that they say, well, large corporations, they don't help us at all. Novak running around saying, they're sort of our salvation. Corporations will save the country. And the other people are saying, no, it doesn't work. They're not competitive at all. You don't have this free enterprise going. You got government help for them in all kind of ways. I better save time to talk theology, something that maybe I know a little bit about anyway. Charlie, were you going to say something?
Just one other point that I don't know is the whole health care side of it. Part of the characters that we all identify with.
People that you do get sort of a general consensus that the welfare system has to be reformed. No matter what side you're on, almost everyone says it's a mess. And the President intends to make a statement about this soon in his radio address. He made a general statement that he was going to send up legislation which would generally decentralize, going exactly opposite of what the bishops were calling for in their document. That his idea was to get it back into the local level following the general principle of subsidiarity from Pius XI. It should be done at the local level. But the bishops have felt evidently that the subsidiarity principle would not really work well with the welfare situation. It hasn't worked. And the states haven't done the job, and that we need sort of national minimums and so on. Yes? Well, I would say, I presume people heard you because I could hear you. I think there's a lot of agreement on that whatever way we go, it shouldn't break up families. and shouldn't cause the husbands to be gone from the scene. There ought to be incentives to keep families together. I think that's true. Now, the other thing, about the Christian thing, my answer to that is, and I'm going to let it lead into the next theological section here, if you don't mind, is that it seems to me that our Christian faith has to govern the whole of it. That is, we have to see the whole problem in the light of the message of the gospel, the lifestyle that Jesus enjoined upon us, and so on. I don't think you ever back off and say, well, I'm not going to be Christian when I deal with the question of ADC, dependent children, or when I deal with welfare. It seems like every part of the economy, every aspect of economic life in the United States is subject to the judgment of the gospel, and we have to view the whole of it in the light of faith. But what's going to happen, and is clear in my mind as you look at these various Christian people who have theories about it, is that you will end up differing on policy. And the bishops recognize that. The bishops recognize that when you start to say exactly what are we supposed to do, that we're going to get a difference of opinion. But the general thing is that we have to approach it from the viewpoint of faith, from the word go, and thoroughly throughout, all the way through, the gospel values have to be part of it. So let me use that to move into talking about the teachings of Jesus. Well, first, what I did in the notes for you is simply summarize what the bishops say in the one part of the pastoral under the Roman numeral 2, the teachings of Jesus. And fundamentally, what they do is borrow heavily from the Gospel of Luke. The theory is that the Gospel of Luke was written to a community that was sort of mixed, that you had some affluent people around in the middle 80s, wherever Luke was writing, and in this community that you started to get some people who were rising above better off, and there was a split between the very poor people in the community and these others. And so Luke's gospel had to address that problem. Now, if you start reading that gospel from the viewpoint of economics, it is amazing how much Jesus talked about in Luke about poor and wealth and woe to you wealthy people, and told parables about money and so on. It's really quite incredible. It's just throughout, and I would invite people to do that. And when you start thinking in those terms, you see it all the way through Luke's gospel, from the beginning point of Mary's Magnificat. That Mary, gives this great hymn to the poor in a sense. This notion that the poor will be exalted by God, and the well-to-do, the rich, will be pulled down. So that Mary's great hymn, somehow I think people have not generally understood that. The Magnificat has nice rhythm to it and so on, and they think of it as sort of a soft kind of prayer made to God, but it's got a real bite in it. The mighty are going to be ripped from their thrones and pulled down, and the lowly and the poor will be exalted. And then in Luke's gospel, when Jesus starts out, the first thing he does, his first sermon, is to identify himself with the words of Isaiah that he has come to preach the good news to the poor, to free the captives. It's something that we really have trouble getting a hold of. It's still foreign to much of our thinking. And then throughout the whole of the gospel, you got the strictures on the rich. Woe to the rich. He warns his followers against greed. Tells the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Rich man unaware of Lazarus and so on. Calls the poor blessed. So all the way through, what the bishops do is sort of summarize the kind of things you would find in Luke's gospel, reading it from the viewpoint of the poor. I suppose part of the invitation would be for us to try to do that and to make it our own in one way or another. Now, some of you heard Donald Sr. talk, and this is a biblical scholar from Chicago, and one of the things he's written a lot about these days is the inclusive character of the life and teachings and actions of Jesus. He likes to talk about Jesus as the barrier breaker. And one of the main ways that Jesus was a barrier breaker was in terms of his miracles. And that in his miracles, Jesus was not just curing people. That's what jumps out at us, that he cures people. but that what he was doing is taking those people he was curing and bringing them back into the mainstream of society. And again, you have to try to get a feel for that, those who were ill, the lepers being a great example of this, were thought to be somehow evil, possessed by demons, and they were shunned from the society, cut off, put on the margin. Illness in general was thought of that way. Any illness was you were possessed by a demon. Yeah, I suppose the parallel today, the clear parallel, is with AIDS in our own society today. The desire to ostracize, not to let children go to school if they have AIDS, for example. A feel for what it was like in that culture for almost any sickness. Now, what does Jesus do in that case? Well, a good example of that is the cure of the leper, where Jesus cures the leper, but then he tells him to go and show yourself to the priest. And the import of that is that the priest is the one who could certify the cure after 7 days or so, that he really was cured, thus being able to officially welcome him back into the community and to allow him now to participate more fully in the society. So Jesus not only is curing people and working wonders and therefore showing the power of God, but he is trying to be inclusive, call back into the mainstream. Senior talks about the cure of Peter's mother-in-law again, which almost seems like a frivolous cure in some ways, but he links it to a return to a life of service. Well, as we read in there, after he raised her up, then she proceeds to attend to their needs, to wait on them, to serve them. Now, you can read that in a negative way, as many feminists do today, but you can also read it as a general call to discipleship, that the cure trouble. Yeah. Where is it? That's Luke 13, yeah. The woman bent over double. The way Don Senior, she's like that for 18 years, and this is on a Sabbath, and Jesus cures her, and then, as he likes to interpret it, defends her right to participate in the Sabbath worship. Well, so many of the cures of Jesus had that sense of bringing back in. And also that he would reach out and cure others. The Gerasene demoniac, for example, the non-Jew, Jesus would touch them also. Miracles as being inclusive, barrier breaking. Now, he does that not only through miracles, but also through his actions. Now, again, one has to get a feel for his times, but as has often been reported, women in the time of Jesus were excluded from the life of the community. They were not allowed to be present during serious religious discussions. In fact, men were not allowed to talk to women in public. And they were surely not allowed to touch them. And yet, what do we find Jesus? Talking to the woman at the well in public. That shocked his disciples no end when they came back. What's his doing through action? Barrier breaking, getting over social taboos, being inclusive, drawing people in. And, again, the women very often throughout the Gospels are brought into the activity. So this woman, this good Samaritan at the well, she's given the job to go evangelize her people. And she is now an apostle in a sense. Mary Magdalene the same way. When she sees Jesus, she is the first witness to the resurrection. The first apostle, meaning the one sent out to tell the good news. So that in the Gospels, rather than the women being on the outcasts and the margins, Jesus is constantly drawing them in. He even touched them in public, something unheard of for a good Jewish man to do, breaking down the taboos. One of the prime ways that his actions overcame the barriers was the meals he had with sinners and with the outcasts. Prime example here would be the eating at the house of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, a tax collector, he was the main tax collector in Jericho, which was a major crossroads, and he would collect the tolls that went as people went through that area, and he would then give 40% of that to the Romans. And so he was a collaborator with the Romans, and these people got rich, especially the head tax collectors, because they were always taking a little extra for themselves, ripping off the travelers and the trade moving through that area. So Zacchaeus was a wealthy man. And what does Jesus do? Well, he breaks down this barrier. They were the outcasts for sure. I mean, hated by their own people and despised by the Romans as being quislings, as we would say today. And so here's this terrible outcast, climbs a tree, and Jesus spots him and says, I will eat dinner at your house. Well, I mean, for us today, we lose the bite of that, but at that time, I mean, that would just be, oh, what? He's going, that crumb? I mean, that guy ripping us off, he's going to go eat at his house? It's the same idea of barrier breaking. The worst of people in the society, Jesus had great feelings for and was ready to reach out and to draw them in. Then the third way that Jesus is inclusive is in terms of his teaching. As we say here, he linked the love of God and love of neighbor, including even enemies you're supposed to be nice to. God loves all people, good and bad alike. We're supposed to be reconciled with one another. And then he mentions the parables in Luke 15, which were really, those are the great mercy parables. We get the prodigal son there in Luke 15. The idea that Jesus was defending himself and going out to the outcasts and saying, hey, that's how Abba is. That's how God Yahweh deals with people. He is merciful in his judgment, and therefore we're supposed to live in the same way. Jesus identifies himself with the poor people in his teaching, Matthew 25, so on. Banquet parables, again. So the guests opened to everybody, the poor, the lame, and so on. So we get a picture of the inclusive Jesus, barrier breaking. Now, as Joan said, that when we begin to think about 33 million or 20 million people, or my friend who's on welfare, the Christian is supposed to view that with the lenses provided by the gospel, to try to see that through the eyes of Jesus. And if you did that, and that became part of you, then one would immediately have a sense of compassion in that situation. One has to immediately say, well, it's not right for that woman to be on the margins. Oh, I got to try to find her a lawyer that will take care of her. What can I do to help her get a big brother? What means can be taken here to overcome this kind of situation? If one really is put, as Paul says, we're supposed to put on the mind of Christ, and that becomes our way then of looking at this question of the poor people. What we want to do, I have two more major sections, one that doesn't appear here on the notes, talking about Christology, and then this book, The Holy Use of Money, that I want to talk about. To complete our Christology. I think, though, people have been sitting longer than the squirm factor allows. We better take a 5-minute break and return. The poverty in our country, we've got a lot of poor people, and that is hard. It's not just they don't have enough to eat, it's a question of powerlessness, of being on the margins. And then what we're saying is we want to look at this through the eyes of Jesus Christ, and we're trying to get some sense of who he was and how he functioned and what he was all about. And so we tried to look at Luke's gospel and say that Jesus in Luke's gospel is himself poor. He identifies himself with poor. Throughout there's a message for the poor people. There are strictures against the rich. And there's a whole way that Jesus acts here that is on the side of the poor, as we call it these days. He exercised a preferential option for the poor. Then we tried to look at Jesus as the barrier breaker, that he is inclusive in his actions, eating with the marginalized, and healing people who are considered to be outsiders, and preaching a message of love of even enemies and people who are different and so on. Now, I think I'll finish this Christology section, and then we'll see if we have questions or comments at that point. The next heading that I want to take up under looking at the teachings of Jesus Christ do not appear in your notes, and I will call that a transforming Christology. Transforming Christology. That is, an understanding of Jesus Christ as one who came to challenge the status quo and who unleashed a power that would change hearts and which would change society. And the theory involved in that is that the salvation and redemption that Christ brought is not just individual. It's not just He's saving souls. He's saving bodied people. Individuals with bodies who interact, who live in institutions and in a larger community. So that Jesus' grace is not just personal, but it's corporate. He redeems hearts, but He also redeems systems and structures. That God's grace is operative in the whole of the world, in our social and institutional life, as well as our private prayer life. Now that's a thought that is foreign to much of the upbringing of many people in the room here, at least, where grace was thought of as being a very personal thing, personal relationship, me and God, binding me to God, and so on. But what we're beginning to understand now is that both sin and grace exist in a corporate way as well. So we have social sin. We have the fact that people's greed and their avarice, their poor decisions get embedded in institutions, and that structures have a life of their own, and very often they're oppressive. They systematically screen out people. So we live in our economy and our structure, the way it's all organized, puts certain people living in ghettos in big cities with not many ways to get out, not many options in life. There's a systemic evil there. There's a reason why half of the black children under 6 are living in poverty, and why we got a 50% unemployment among black teenagers. There are structural reasons for that, institutional reasons for all of that. One needs only to go back to the institution of slavery to get a feel for why we have some of the minority problems along that line. So, not only do we have social sin, though, but we also have social grace. We also have God's blessings that are on institutions and systemic life, so that those are to be transformed as well. The message of Jesus has meaning for all of that. And the people of His time understood that. The establishment people in charge of the institutions understood in a way that what He was saying would affect them, that they were in trouble. That's one of the reasons they had to attack Him. That's why the religious authorities wanted to get rid of Him. He undercut the system that they had set up. Attacked it. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself, I forget. But that whole idea of the cleansing of the temple, which so interesting that the temple becomes a place, a financial center. And Jesus had to go into the financial center, in a sense, and clean it out. Attack the very system that was used very often, as is reported by the Scripture scholars who know the period, the ripping off of the people in all this money changing and so on. Jesus attacks all of that. It's one of the reasons it's commonly thought that Jesus was popular with the poor people, because He had defended them. He had been their champion in attacking this temple financial structure there. So, transforming Christology believes that the grace of Christ has the power to make a new creation, a new being, as Paul Tillich called it, a new system, a new way of operating. That there's a suggestion, therefore, that the community of followers of Jesus are supposed to image that, symbolize it. That's why we got a church, in a way, to be a sign of the kingdom, to be a sign that you can relate in other ways, not on the basis of power versus powerlessness, and not domination, but of mutuality. That's why we have a great responsibility, those of us who belong to Christian communities, to make it be like that. where people are accepted for what they are and where people look out for those less fortunate. You get an idyllic picture of that in the Acts of the Apostles, where you have a communistic system. That is, all the people held their goods in common. And we had that strange story of the people who didn't give their goods to the common good, fell over, dead. Had to carry them out because they weren't into the system of mutuality, of care and concern. The ones who wouldn't buy into the communistic system were, the Lord zapped them, one way of saying it. So, we get a picture in the New Testament of the early community, and that is an idyllic picture, commonly assumed that the community didn't really function like that, that it is a picture of how the author wanted it to be, and how he would have liked it to be. So, a transforming Christology is one element in how we would try to attack this question of poverty. It puts us in mind of institutions and structures and the need to transform them. Now I want to summarize for you a book called The Holy Use of Money. I don't know this guy, John. Does anybody know him? Or how you say his name? Haughey. I think I've seen him some places, but I've never met him personally. Anyway, what he says is that in Jesus' time, he went about attacking what he called mammon illness. That there was a sickness that pervaded the society and individual hearts at that time. And it was put under that heading of mammon, which is a way of saying money or possessions gone wild, out of control and out of hand. And that this began to dominate people, and it dominated the system and structure of Jesus' time. So there was a mammon illness that Jesus encountered in his society, and that he took it to be his job to attack it and to heal that illness. Now, this mammon illness, according to this book, had three components. One is that people were anxiously running after possessions as a means of gaining security. So to be sick with mammon is to put one's trust in having more things. To get caught up in having possessions, accumulating things. And so that Jesus attacked that element of mammon sickness by himself living very simply, of not having any place to lay his head, of trying to get people over anxiety about it by talking about the lilies of the field and the birds of the air that don't toil and don't do any of those things. Yet God cares for them. It's all right. There was a constant message in Jesus, and I think this is contained in the New Testament for us yet. Don't get all bent out of shape. Don't get overly anxious about material things, about having things, acquiring, accumulating. And then there is that telling story of the man who was so caught up. He had mammon illness to the point that he had a great harvest, and then he built bigger grain bins and stored all the stuff in there. And he finally, was coming to terms. He was taking care of his anxiety. He was getting security. He had an insurance policy now to cover almost anything that would occur. No troubles could get at him. Now we can relax. Interesting to analyze these parables from this viewpoint. He can now relax, get over his anxiety, and eat, drink, and be merry. And then the telling words, "Thou fool, you fool, this day your very life will be required of you." And the foolishness, is not just in building grain bins, but the foolishness is in placing one's security in these material things. It's to misplace one's trust. It's to make a big, big mistake. And It's to forget what human existence is all about. You fool says you got it just totally backward. You don't understand what the source, the only possible source of security is in the world, which can finally only be in God and not in any material possession. So the first problem with mammon illness is that one is running after things, is anxious, trying to provide for oneself through material things. The second element in mammon illness is an insensitivity or a numbness. It is that one gets so caught up in the material world that one doesn't notice those who are suffering, doesn't notice those who are bad off. One gets blinded. Again, it's back to that poverty has no face, that when Andy Young walks around homeless, no one wants to look at him. Well, we don't want to encounter poverty, I suppose, because it makes us feel bad or guilty. I thought, what would it be like to go to Calcutta and walk the streets? I mean, could one really deal with that psychically? Some of those people are born and raised and die in a little part of the street. Those are ones Mother Teresa has taken care of. In other words, Mother Teresa is who is the opposite of numbness. She doesn't do it by blinding her feelings or masking the kind of personal hurt that comes one's way in dealing with those. She doesn't mask those kind of feelings, but lets herself experience that, but transforms them into compassion. So part of mammon illness is you don't see it. So what does Jesus do? In response, Jesus pulls them out and brings them forward and brings them back into the society and goes to their houses and makes them visible, calls them by name, forces his disciples to come to grips with these people. He calls them together. For Jesus, all of these poor people were not faceless, but they were unique individuals and that he treasured. And again, not only by action, but by parable. And so he tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And what is it about the rich man? He doesn't even notice him. He doesn't notice the poor man. Oh, and what happens when they die? We see that it's all reversed. That the rich man has seemed to have it made and was so caught up in his wealth and his good status in society that when he gets into the next world, it's all different. Now he's down, he's out. There's a great gulf between him and those who enjoy happiness. There is an immense abyss. So much so that you can't even reach across it. Now he is the marginalized. He's the one who's on the outside now. And the poor man is in the bosom of Abraham. He resides with the community, part of the whole thing. Again, the parables of Jesus are always showing that life isn't like we think it is. It isn't what it looks like, appears on the surface. It isn't like the kind of notions we ingest and we drink in from the culture as we grow up in it. We're so programmed to think in one way, to identify success with goodness, for example, and fair. I mean, again, we got this whole mentality that bishops try to attack, that the poor are somehow bad, and they're bad because they're bad people, lazy, shiftless, irresponsible, that's why they're poor. And there's many people, good-thinking people, who assume that. They just think that way because you grow up in a culture that makes you think that way, and people can't think for themselves. They can't rise above the mass. But to put on the mind of Christ means to see it another way, to get over mammon illness, and to get sensitized to the real plight of the poor and the real situation that they are in. Again, striking parable that Jesus uses to cut through all of that. Now, the third characteristic of mammon illness is what the author calls split consciousness. That is, that now one has divided loyalties. It's like, well, I would go to services on Sunday and say my prayers, and I consider myself to be a good Christian. I'm in all of that. But over here in the business world, now here's where you got to be hard-headed. This is where you got to be pragmatic and have other sets of values. So that to have split consciousness means there's no correspondence between the world of faith and the world of economics, of finances, of buying and selling. No connections between the gospel and governmental policy. Split consciousness. Or you can analyze it another way and talk about split allegiances. That is, that there's some ways in which one says, well, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus. And that's what I'm about. But there's certain things about my life and who I am that I want to hang on to. I'm not ready to give them up. I'm not really ready to, I don't even want anybody to ask me to give them up. There could be a lot of things. It could be status, could be the respect that one enjoys with others. It could be crassly material possessions. Could be certain pleasures. It could be one's health. Any kind of finite reality could draw our allegiance and be, again, our treasure and therefore where our heart is. But most people would find out that there end up being split, that the reign of God, we see certain things through the eyes of Jesus, but other things we have blinders on. Don't want to see it that way. Now Jesus, in his own life, goes about single-minded. He's got one thing on his mind, to do the will of his Father, to spread the kingdom, to bring about the community of love, to get the cause of peace and justice going. Single-minded. He's got Abba on his mind, doing the will of God. So by his example, nothing else matters. His mother doesn't matter. His relatives don't matter. Who's it? My mother. Oh, I got to be about the will of my Father. Nothing else matters. Single-minded in pursuing the kingdom. Isn't that interesting? All the way along. Let the dead bury the dead. Leave father and boat now and come and follow. It's always the call of Jesus. You can't be split with me. If you're lukewarm, Michael Crosby did a great job on that in the book of Revelations. If you're lukewarm, that's what's terrible. Jesus was looking for commitment. So he lived that way. And then there is the interesting story in the gospel. The classic fellow with a split consciousness, split allegiances. The rich young man who comes to Jesus. Goodwill. He keeps all the laws. He's really serious about the religious life. He's trying to do everything he can to be a good person. And it says in the Scriptures that Jesus loves him. He had an immediate kinship with him. He said, oh man, here's my kind of guy. This guy is serious about commitment and living out what God wants. And so he challenges him. There's one who would love would, and he says, okay, now what you got to do, you got to give up your wealth and your riches and come follow me. And the young man can't do it. He has a split allegiance, and the allegiance to the wealth is still strong. He's tied to that, and therefore he rejects the call. And he senses the sadness. He goes away sad. There's a sadness about the whole scene, that the single-mindedness could not be pursued. That high ideal of commitment to the kingdom gets broken down into a split allegiance. All kind of things in the Gospels where Jesus says the same type of thing. Can't serve God and mammon. Mammon is money run wild. It's possessions that become too important. Can't serve both. So we got mammon illness here in the Scriptures, and Jesus taking it as his path to cure that. I find that to be an interesting way of reading the Scriptures. Oh, the author does a lot more with this. I don't know how much more of this I want to try to summarize for you. But maybe it comes down to what he's about is to say, he uses funny words for this. He talks about Jesus coming to sublate the economy. Jesus doesn't come into his own economic world to be indifferent to it, or he doesn't ignore it, but he tries to call it to fullness. Well, we would say today, I suppose, I'm looking for better language for that we would want to transform the economic system. We would want it to become all it should be. I think it's the bishops who are doing that when they say we've got a dream here in our country, we've got a potential, and we could reach that. It's not like you just say, well, the economic system's unimportant, we Christians are going to get together and pray, we got our thing to do. Not like that, but we've got to be involved. You have to buy things and sell things, and you have to pay taxes and do all kind of economic things. So you can't rise above it in a sense, but we need to be immersed in it and transform it, make it into a better thing. And so what the bishops are about, I think, is trying to get us to think of the economy in those kinds of terms. The material things, therefore, become a means and not an end. They have to be part of what we are about. They have to fit in. He says interesting things. That it doesn't really matter how much you have. It doesn't even matter, he says some things like this, that you could even tithe, and be very faithful to tithing and be all messed up on this question. That's not what's primary. Somebody could take religious practice. In fact, is it not in the Pharisee-publican parable, if I'm remembering it correctly, the Pharisee is this good guy, keeps all the laws, and I think he pays his tithes. And yet, he's off base. There's something wrong with him yet. He's still got mammon illness, even though he's tithing. His problem is his security is still rooted somewhere else than in God. It's rooted in keeping the law, or it might be rooted in tithing. Or it could even be rooted in thanking God for one's riches. You see, in other words, he's trying to get at the root problem. The root problem is that we can forget that we are totally dependent on God. We can make other things be our source of security, even something like tithing. Am I making that clear? In other words, you could tithe, and that's a neat thing to do, and say, great, but one could, in doing it, sort of stand over against God and say, well, I'm doing my bit, God, I'll be ready to enter the pearly gates. I tithe for 43 years, and that's the kind of attitude that would still involve mammon illness. Instead of being able to say, as the publican did, have mercy on me, O Lord, for I'm a sinner. I'm totally dependent on you and on your mercy. So it doesn't seem to have too much to do with how much money we've got, how much wealth and possessions, although there's a limit to that, I suppose. But it's got to do with the fundamental attitude we have towards it. Is it a means to an end? Does it secretly become the source of our security, and that we bank on it, count on it, think that that's exactly what we need to preserve ourselves? Or are we able to be like the lilies of the field and the birds of the air and to let go of all of that? I want to stop now. That's that second section of my talk. I'm trying to talk about Jesus, Christology, and so on. Why don't we take a couple-minute break? I invite you to talk to the person next to you. And why don't you try to pick out of all of that what makes the most impact on you? Of all the things you said about Jesus, what strikes you most strongly? Let's do that for a couple minutes. right, could I have your attention, please? Any questions on the theological section of our material tonight? The story of Jesus and what he was about. I do find it very interesting to reread the Gospels and read the parables from that economic side. It really is a fascinating thing to do. Mary Jane?
Most of us in this room, I think, have had to work with the bureaucracy of the politicians and government. And I don't think we're going to make it to do it. It certainly says we have to work within our own small groups of crisis to change the spirituality and attitude of the people. And if we continue to let the government do that, what they want to, with our money, our tax money, we're not changing their attitude to their spirituality. And they're using our money to do what they want to do. I think that's what we started in our own parish. And instead of making heroes of a small football team or cheerleaders, so that those children grow up to emulate the baseball player, the football player, and make millions of dollars. I think we need ourselves to judge what is the value of Christ and teach our children to love one another. Instead of building monuments in honor of priests or whoever happens to be in the courage, perhaps we ought to take a good look at feeding the spirit in this country. And I think we need to do that as Christ did in small groups, not in our own neighborhood. I think most of us do that on a one-to-one basis. I know my friends do, I do. And I think we need to talk about that too, about the goodness that we have in the country.
Right.
But I think we need to start in our own home before we can reach out to the whole world.
Good. Thank you, Mary Jane. I presume people heard that. It's a plea for conversion of heart and for starting at the local level and for parishes to do their part in the whole process. Yes.
I was just wondering, what's the vision that you're trying to gain by centralizing people like more involved in the way of certain power.
Well, people heard you in making your comment, and I think it's important to remember that the document is not what I call a statist document. It's not a document that is saying that centralized government is supposed to do everything. Is that distinction between government and society that they make. When they say society is supposed to attend to these things, society for them includes all of us, all the economic actors, churches, parishes, city government, state government, the Elks, all the groupings within the society are responsible for trying to create this better world. So I think it is not, and in fact, the bishops in certain places say that very thing that you're saying there, the importance of there's a line here, we believe that an effective way to attack poverty is through programs that are small in scale, locally based, and oriented towards empowering the poor to become self-sufficient. So the experience you're talking about, exactly corresponds with what they're calling for. There's a general misperception of the bishop's pastoral letter that it is calling for more centralized, federal approaches. And there are certain cases in which their position is that all the economic actors in the society got responsibilities and can do things. They enunciate the principle of subsidiarity, that is, that things should be done at the local level if they can be done there. Now they break that when they begin to talk about the welfare question, and I think for a very good reason. I mean, you look at the history of this and the fact that there's a very small payments made to black people, for example, in southern states, and those kinds of problem, one begins to get a feel for why maybe the federal government has to step in or to do certain things. You know, one of the reasons we got this problem in the big cities is because their welfare benefits are better and people flock to there from all over to try to partake of that, and then that sets up a tremendous problem for them. You know, and that's one of the problems the bishops are seeing. Yeah, local level whenever we can, everyone helps, but certain things look like they need a more centralized approach. And that might be one. In other words, if you could get standard welfare payments around the country, then people wouldn't need to flock into the big cities to try to get more welfare. But anyway, that's at least the kind of thinking that's behind it. But the document in general is not a statist document. It's not a document that's calling upon government to do everything. It's not a socialist document. I'm going to move ahead here and say, try to summarize some of the policy choices. Your question leads into that. And again, I'm going to do it in terms of extremes. And that's what the book is, the letter is all about. It always ends up in policy questions. Now, at one extreme, I'm taking a book that's rather well known by Charles Murray called Losing Ground. I think this still appears in your notes, doesn't it? Yeah. Losing Ground. Well, Murray did a lot of studies of the poverty question and so on, and his general conclusion is that the Great Society programs that Lyndon Johnson began and all that we did for the poor in the 60s were totally misguided, that they hurt the poor in the long run, they did more harm than good, and that they were foisted by what the neoconservatives love to call the new class, that is, the intellectuals. Remember, Kennedy was going to bring the best and the brightest into Washington and get the academics back in there and so on. And the neoconservatives say that these people came in, were out of touch with the common people, with popular wisdom, and that they foisted all of these crazy Great Society programs on us, ended up hurting the poor. And so, out of that kind of analysis, this Charles Murray, in a book that's popularly quoted and his ideas are used by many people, says, what we've got to do is scrap the whole welfare system. No, it doesn't do any good anyway, so we scrap everything. Food stamps, Medicaid, workman's compensation, subsidized housing, disability insurance, AFDC, everything, just get rid of it. And then the poor will have to fend for themselves. And then they will be forced to make it. I suppose some harsh critics might think of the strategies that were used in Cambodia. The great marches there to weed out who killed millions of people, so that only the fit would survive. No, I'm talking our own time. Kampuchea, Cambodia. Anyway, that's what this Murray thinks we ought to do. Get rid of all affirmative action programs. No special treatment for anybody. This is an interesting one. And provide a voucher system for education so parents could shop around for schools that best suit their needs. Maybe some people probably, out of all the things he says, would be most open to that kind of approach. Well, anyway, that line is picked up by many other authors. There's usually in more moderate form is a book Beyond Entitlement by Lawrence Mead, and Michael Novak in a way partakes of that philosophy. It's based on the idea that the Great Society in the 60s was a total failure, it didn't do any good, and caused all this harm that we've got now. To take the other extreme, we would find Michael Harrington. Well, Michael Harrington wants a guaranteed full employment, with the government making sure that this happens. And remember in the other, when we talked the other day, it was the idea that he wants them to fund private industry to start building alternate energy sources, especially solar energy, and to put those factories and plants in the inner cities so that the poor people there can be hired into those labor-intensive operations. Michael Harrington, he's a socialist, remember now, he wants not only that, but he wants a guaranteed minimum income for these people. which would be above the poverty line. So that everybody would have, in today's figures, any father of a family was working 40 hours a week would make at least $10,000 a year. So you could, and shouldn't have said it, any woman raising 2 children by herself, no matter what her job would be, she's working full time, she makes $10,000 at least, so that she can raise her kids. Now, Michael Harrington says, and he did a Commonweal article, some of you might have seen it back in 1984, I think it was right after this Murray's book came out, attacking it, and saying we didn't have a war on poverty in the 1960s. All we had were light skirmishes. We just were starting. We weren't really getting into a clear